Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for joining us. If you've never been to one of our events before, we're the BAFTSS Horror Studies SIG, and we run reasonably regular events looking at different kind of topics in horror studies. Screaming Bloody Murder, which explores the connections between horror and true crime. We've got a fantastic panel of some very good friends of the SIG and some good friends of mine, which is lovely. But I'm going to let our chair introduce them. But I'm going to ask our chair, hello. Our chair tonight is another lovely friend and colleague, Dr. Stella Marie Gaynor. Stell is a lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University. She's the author of an excellent book, Rethinking Horror in the New Economies of Television. And Stell's new work is on murder media, which looks at the representation of true crime across different media platforms. And she has just this event kind of comes off the back of a fantastic series of murder media podcast. If you haven't had a listen to it, we'll put a link in the chat maybe later on, or find a link. Yeah. Do have a listen, because I think it's really fantastic and features a couple of our guests for this evening as well. So this event follows on from that very successful first series. And I'm going to hand over to Stell, and yeah, good luck.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Laura, and thanks, Shellie, for having us this evening. So as Laura said, I did do series 1 of the Murder Media podcast. Now that I've said series 1, that means that I now have to do series 2. So hopefully that will arrive in the new year. We'll see. But tonight I've got the absolute pleasure of being joined by 3 incredible academics who love their horror and love their true crime. So first off, I've got Bethan Jones from Cardiff University. I've got Tom Watson from Teesside University and Shellie McMurdo from Hertfordshire University. So if you guys could put your cameras on so we can see your lovely faces. Hello. Okay, right. So I'm going to get us started because I'm sure we've got an awful lot to talk about. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening on this cold, chilly, really stressful end of semester Wednesday evening. And tonight we're going to discuss, as Laura said, the overlap between horror and true crime. So there's clearly an overlap in interest. Just look at the panel, look at all the people in the, in the virtual room. We're all horror fans, and hopefully everyone are true crime fans as well. But there's clearly lots of overlaps in the form, the generic modes, the fan practices, and the themes and the characters between true crime and horror. So horror borrows from true crime all the time. We've got the big ones that we all know, Texas Chainsaw and Silence of the Lambs, using our friend Ed Gein. We've got the Amityville Horror and the DeFeo murders, An American Horror Story, and the serial killers all having dinner in the hotel on Devil's Night. And then later, American Horror Story 1984 had Richard Ramirez in his more satanic form. And then in turn, contemporary true crime media borrows from horror. So recent true crime media texts feature fictionalized elements to sort of echo horror texts that we might be familiar with, to make the tale more grisly than it already is, or perhaps to just have a cross-genre appeal. True crime has appropriated dramatic techniques, lots of which look and feel like horror. So we get reenactments that feel like slasher films, like in the 2002 film called Bundy, about bullshit Bundy, and there's a few sequences in that run like a slasher film. Then we've got lots of true crime that has lots of blood and gore and chopped up bodies, lots of death counts, high death counts rather, and lots of torture. So if we look at Ryan Murphy's work again with his 2 monster series, the Dahmer series showed us in detail the bodies on the bed, lots of detail in the Polaroids, and the drill on the side in the kitchen still dripping with blood. In the more recent Menendez series that Murphy did, that murder scene with the 2 brothers shoot the parents to death, obviously to death. Stella shoots the parents with shotguns at really close range, and it's all slowed down so you can see every splashing, splattering detail of the murder. Sometimes true crime borrows from horror in slightly more subtle ways. I wouldn't call Ryan Murphy subtle at all. But if you look at Memories of Murder, the Dennis Nilsen tapes, which purports to be a documentary, it feels like a gothic theatre play at times, with the talking heads being sat in these decaying recreations of Nilsen's flat at Cranley Gardens, these dark, dreary representations of Nilsen's own claims to be a romantic, troubled soul, when of course he wasn't. So with all that being said, we've got a great panel here, and like I said, all with an interest in true crime and horror. So let's get into exploring this overlap. So the first thing I want to talk about is, or want you guys to talk about, is a very broad question. So what are the key ways that true crime and horror overlap? Thinking about themes, characters, and locations. And I want to throw this first to Tom. You're muted, fella.
that was my. Am I muted? Can everyone hear me? Is that working okay? Without fail, all of the time. So yeah, so I really appreciate first and foremost being invited to kind of partake in this really interesting panel discussion. I have got the questions in front of me, so I have obviously been listening, but I'm going to kind of refer to them just so I'm not veering off on loads of tangents, which I fear I may already be doing. So I think for me, I'm going to kind of start by talking about some of my formative experiences, kind of engaging with horror and true crime and kind of how they overlap and how they've kind of led me to thinking about the ways in which they kind of inform each other, or they kind of extend various legends and lore and kind of true crime case histories of various kind of murderers and their kind of indiscretion, shall we say. And I think I've kind of mentioned this before. So like the two things that stand out a lot for myself as a kind of a horror academic talking about formative experiences. The first one is on one of my many visits to Forbidden Planet when I was a kid in Newcastle upon Tyne, Granger Street. My nan used to take me into Forbidden Planet all the time. Used to kind of get spoiled with various action figures and things like that. The thing that really stands out is the American one-sheet poster for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like who will survive and what will be left of them. And obviously, like not knowing any context around that at the time, having never seen the film, obviously by that point, I think it was about maybe 7 or 8 when I was kind of made aware of that. Obviously, that's based on Ed Gein. You've already kind of mentioned him in your introduction. So there's already overlap there. Not that I knew about that at the time anyway, but it always intrigued me and kind of like learning about that film and kind of learning about the events, what it's based on, is obviously a really intense experience for a young kid to kind of learn about, I think, and maybe why I'm interested in some of the things I'm interested now. The other kind of example that I would kind of use as a form of experience, and talked about this as well, as like my mom's bookshelf with the Thomas Harris novels. So I think Silence of the Lambs was something that I would be intrigued by, alongside all the kind of Stephen King paperbacks that she'd have, kind of pulling them off again, not really understanding what that meant or what it was, but obviously how that's kind of based on again Ed Gein and kind of various different kind of the case history around that. So that's kind of my own interests in where those things kind of overlap, some of the kind of the more well-known or established kind of ways of thinking about that. But what I've just thought about and kind of what I've been mulling over the past few days is that there seems to be certain examples of horror films, and I'm talking about horror here, which do tie back to true crime cases and their case histories. But there seems to be certain examples that kind of correspond to different movements or moments in the horror genre as it's kind of been developing. And there's some really interesting kind of touch points where these films are kind of almost used to redefine or reclassify what horror can be, or what it could be. So one of the examples, aside from things like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and obviously that gets lumped in with a lot of kind of slasher movies. We can debate whether or not that is accurate. Obviously the film coming out in 1974, predating a lot of the kind of films that would we consider as kind of slasher movies, maybe a proto slasher in that sense. But obviously that's following things like Psycho the decade before, and that's obviously kind of tied into again the same case. But that got me thinking about something like Henry Portrait, a serial killer, which obviously comes out in the late 1980s. We kind of have that this really sort of like intense, visceral horror movie. And again, I think Cynthia Freeland talks about it as like realist horror. So it kind of comes away from maybe versions of the genre that have existed before. And obviously we're talking about franchise horror in the 1980s, or certain examples of more mainstream horror. But that kind of marks something else. It's kind of like there's a realism to that. There's a reality to the aesthetic of the film. It's obviously tying into a real case history, and kind of the legend or kind of the lore around that. And obviously that kind of extends into some of the examples. Maybe also Silence of the Lambs in the 1990s. obviously this kind of mainstream example of horror that gets all of the accolades, but it's based on this really kind of grimy, true crime history. So I think for me, like I've said, it's kind of moments within the genre, those kind of horror true crime crossovers maybe make or have made people stop and kind of reassess what the genre is. And that's kind of a lot of the formative ways that I've been thinking about it. So yeah, I'm gonna shut up and let someone else kind of have a go there. I hope that makes sense. It's just stuff
Yeah.
I've been thinking of. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting what you said about the moments in horror, and you know, this, I think this came up on the podcast several times, that Silence of the Lambs was a really key text for people essentially our age. It's one of the first things that we saw that was dealing with this kind of stuff, and it won Oscars, right? Didn't it win Oscars, that film? So you know,
Yes.
anyone our age, I'm not saying what it is, but anyone our age, that was a key moment, along with, you know, things like Texas Chainsaw. All right then, so same question then. So what are the key ways that true crime and horror overlap, thinking about themes and characters and locations? Bethan, what's your thoughts?
Well, I was just thinking as Tom was talking about that more kind of maybe historical true crime. And I was thinking about the number of horror films about Jack the Ripper. So obviously, like, you've got From Hell, which is, you know, based on Alan Moore's graphic novel, but it's about Jack the Ripper, and there's that sense of it's an interesting case because there's some debate about whether we know who Jack the Ripper actually is now. But it's one of those, it combines these elements of horror, like this figure appearing out of, you know, these Victorian London streets and brutally murdering people and then disappearing into the night, which is, you know, quite a terrifying thought. And I think that kind of combines that sort of true crime horror element quite well. And I guess my interest is more kind of audience responses and kind of practices around horror and true crime. But I think they both, as texts, give audiences sort of safe ways to be scared. Because, you know, when we think about true crime and the fact that, you know, it's predominantly a sort of women's genre, women make up most of the audience, you know, it teaches you ways to be safe, which is debatable. But that and horror as well, you go in and you kind of, you know, you're going to be scared and you enjoy that, but then you come out of the cinema, or, you know, you turn the lights on in your room and everything is fine. So I think that, for me, that's an interesting way that they both overlap. Like, they can allow us to, like, explore these kind of dark topics in a safe way, and then, you know, laugh about it afterwards or talk about it over the coffee machine in work the next morning.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying there about that true crime could sort of teach you something. You know, I was thinking about how true crime would teach me to not walk alone at night on my own, or to not have, you know, headphones on at night, or to not go through the park, or to maybe not go for a run at night. And all of those scenarios sound like a horror film as much as true crime. So the things that you become scared of, they're kind
totally,
of
because
as well.
because like when we're watching a horror film, like, you know, you don't go up the stairs when you hear a noise in the house. Like, you run out the door, otherwise you're going to get killed by a serial killer.
Ghostface isn't going to come into your house, or is he? All right then. So, Shellie, then, last one. What are the key ways that true crime and horror overlap for you?
I was thinking I'd quite like Ghostface to be in my house, but I think that's just me.
Can you get a Ghostface-agram, like a kissogram?
Is that a thing? I wish it was. I was thinking like about what Tom said, and I noticed, you know, in listening to your most excellent podcast, that a lot of us that were guests on it, our kind of formative experiences with true crime were our mum's bookshelf. And like my mum, she was obsessed with the Moores murderers, and there were these all these books about the Moores murderers on the top shelf. Like, don't look at those. And of course, like, that's, as soon as you tell me don't look at something, that's what I want to look at. And my kind of, the way I connect true crime and horror is, I think partially, like, personally, I came to the two interests probably about the same time. Maybe horror slightly before, and that kind of sparked my interest in true crime. But I think one of the ways that I connect them in my head is they're both, for want of a better word, kind of outsider genres. Like, I know when I was 14, 15 at school, I was the weird girl that was into horror films and serial killers. And so that's kind of, I connect them in my head like that. I think true crime is maybe, and horror are also kind of maybe shifting at the moment. I mean, they periodically kind of shift in and out of popularity anyway, but with the rise of the kind of glossy Netflix true crime documentaries, and, you know, I hate the term, but post elevated horror, people are sort of viewing them in different ways, and maybe now we have to go somewhere else for like the outsider aspect, like within the same genre, but maybe look for that outside of these glossy versions of these outsider genres. That's kind of how I connect it in my head anyway.
Yeah, that's interesting, because when I tried to answer this question myself, I was thinking about, you know, they both explore fear and violence, they both got psychological tension, they've both got moral ambiguity, they're both exploring social issues and all the stuff that we talk about. You know, horror means this, and the metaphor is there, and all that kinds of things. But when Netflix, say for instance, is making these glossy series like the Dahmer one and the Menendez one, it seems that the glossy stuff is still pivoting around the big names, and that maybe to make it more, I guess, like you say, a bit more edgy, would be to apply the gloss, bless you, apply the gloss to perhaps a case that is, it's not more gross, but a case that is perhaps less known. So, you know, we all know what Dahmer did, we all know what Bundy did, we all know what Gein did, but what about, say, I don't know, the Chicago Rippers? It's like, that was a horrific case, and it's like, is Ryan Murphy going to tell that with Evan Peters? I don't know, I'm not sure, and I'm wondering if that's where it needs to go next, and to get away from the same stories over and over and over again. So with that in mind, then the next question is, what's there to be said? And it, you know, is coming off what you've said, Shellie, what's there to be said about true crime and horror and shock value? Can it still do that? Do true crime and horror texts, are they still both trying to do this? Is it possible to shock anymore? You know, we've got, like I said, we've got Evan Peters playing Dahmer, you know, close-up shots of him with no top on lifting weights, and it's like, aren't we supposed to hate this guy? Why is he being framed, you know, like a sex symbol? What are you doing, Murphy? This is very odd. So do you think that, you know, what do you think about true crime, horror and shock value? What can they do? What do they need to do, Shellie?
It wouldn't let me stay like unmuted then. That was really weird. I think it really depends, doesn't it? I mean, like at the moment I'm obsessed with the Terrifier films, and of course I was going to shoehorn into talking about them here, but it's a matter of kind of audience and expectation, I think, because I go see Terrifier and I know why I'm going to go see it, and I know what the pleasure that I get from it. But if someone went to go see that who the only horror film they've ever seen is, say, I don't know, Hereditary or something, not to pick on post-horror again, but if that's going to be much more shocking to them. And I think, you know, like you mentioned the Menendez brothers, the monster Ryan Murphy Menendez brothers docudrama earlier, I found it really unshocking, and it was kind of really sold to me as, oh my god, the murder scene is so graphic and so gory, and I watched it and went, oh, it's a bit CGI, and I wasn't that impressed by it. And I think that's a kind of an expectation audience thing. Whereas I know if someone like, you know, one of my best friends, Emily, she's really, really into true crime, she would find that very shocking. So I think shocking is kind of a movable feast of a term. But I think, yeah, maybe like what you said about it's always the big hitters. You know, we know what Bundy did, we know what Dahmer did. Maybe that's where the shock factor then comes from, is talking about a case that is less well known.
Yeah.
But it would be virtually impossible for someone who is familiar with true crime to be shocked by anything about Bundy, because we know what he did.
Yeah. But yeah, if a glossy series about, let's say Chicago Rippers, the only one I can think of, if that lands on Netflix, that will have shock value, mainly because it's a new story. Maybe that's just intrinsically where it lies. So thinking about shock value, then I want to start talking about, because I'm super excited about it, I want to start talking about fans and murderabilia. Bethan, this is yours. So thinking about shock, can we still do that? Can we talk about murderabilia?
Yes, but I want to just think about shock for a minute, because there's something that you were saying about, you know, the Ryan Murphy Menendez brothers, and in the Columbine subreddit, which I'm a member of, and I imagine most people know Columbine, the high school shooting in the late 90s. Someone asked there, do you think Ryan Murphy will do a series about Columbine? And everyone was like, no, he wouldn't touch it. It is too much for television, for Netflix. But I think that would shock if that was, if we had a glossy Columbine Netflix series. I think that would have massive shock value. And I'm wondering whether it's kind of the content, because it's kids killing kids and it's, in a school. And I wonder whether that is the shock value, kids and animals. Like, is that where we sort of draw the line? We're fine with killing people and, eating people and what have you, but when it's kids and animals, that's too much. But yeah, but Murderabilia it's really fascinating. So I'm writing a chapter at the moment on Murderabilia, and I've done some audience research. So I've circulated a questionnaire, and so far I've had 26 responses, but they're really, really detailed and really, really in depth. And two of the questions I asked, one was, are you a serial killer fan? And the other was, are you a true crime fan? And the majority of people said they are not serial killer fans, but they are true crime fans. And there was a lot of discussion about what it means to be a fan in terms of like collecting murderabilia and stuff. And a lot of them also said that, they don't really tell people that they collect murderabilia because it's still seen as this weird practice, and like if you collect it, you've got to be this like weird sicko. At what point are you then going to start going off and killing people yourself, kind of thing? And that, I think, it's still a shock value. Like, collecting murderabilia is still something that shocks people. And even like we were talking earlier about kind of Ted Bundy t-shirts and the kind of merch, and like the serial killer action figures and the Ted Bundy saint candles. All of those are kind of shock value as well, because they're essentially kind of fan merchandise. And it's sort of like, well, why would you collect merchandise for these horrific figures? And I've probably got like there's loads to say about it, but I know Tom has done some stuff on murderabilia and dark tourism, so I'm getting kind of, I don't want to just blah all of my thoughts at you guys.
Well, I mean, what you said about collecting merch about, horrible characters, like I've got, I mean, it's downstairs, but in The Walking Dead, Negan's bat with the barbed wire.
I've got it up here.
I've got one of them as well, and that's fine. And he bashes people's heads in with that, and that's okay to have.
Yeah,
sort of. But if you have merch that's about another dodgy character that's real, then suddenly you're in a different place.
Yeah. It's that real fiction thing that's really interesting.
It's confusing. Tom, you've written about murderabilia.
You're on mute.
That working?
Yes.
I need to stop fanning about with my microphone. So I'll go to the issue of shock, because I've got some thoughts on that, and then I've got plenty of thoughts on murderabilia, having done a little bit of research around that. So for me, I think in terms of shock, and again, I guess I'm talking from my own subjective perspective, because I guess we are kind of talking about shock being a subjective experience. What someone might find shocking is obviously going to be different, and obviously cultural capital that we have, if we're used to kind of various elements of a genre, we kind of go into things with certain expectations, and that might be quite different to other people, how they experience that. I think in terms of true crime, in true crime narratives, and I'm kind of talking more so about documentaries and maybe docudramas as well, aren't necessarily new cases or kind of things that haven't necessarily been said before. It might be sort of either new perspectives or new takes on cases that might be fairly familiar. But I think what I find more shocking, and it doesn't happen very often, and I think there's a very sort of an imbalance between kind of focus on the actual murderer or serial killer or whatever that is, versus the voices of the victims and maybe people who aren't necessarily considered or have a voice within those particular narratives. So one of the examples that I found really shocking fairly recently would be the kind of and we're not talking about serial murder, obviously. We're talking about other kind of criminality, but the docudrama about Jimmy Savile, where Steve Coogan is obviously portraying Jimmy Savile throughout his life, and obviously talking about the various instances of his crimes and things like that. And obviously, you know, you can take that as at face value. It's quite a disturbing performance anyway, given that we know about those particular crimes. But the thing with that docuseries is that you had victims who were then being interviewed, who are kind of fictionalized and portrayed by actors in the series, but they're kind of bookending the episodes, and it's kind of like, I don't know, that to me, it's kind of a bit of a jarring kind of sensation between, you know, this is a fictionalized account of this versus someone's real experience, and that's kind of brought together in quite a visceral way, and I found that quite shocking or disturbing almost. I think that was kind of really effective for me watching that. So things like that I think do kind of have quite a high degree of shock value, but maybe in a different way. And obviously not talking about blood, guts, and gore, but kind of maybe on a more, like I said, disturbing level. So that's kind of what I was thinking about shock when you guys were talking. The thing about Murderpedia, and this came from some research, and basically it was a module that I used to teach, and there was a week on celebrity culture, and I thought, well, I want to do something about the dark side of celebrity culture. And this was kind of a lot of the discourse around serial killers as celebrity was kind of coming back into not fashion, but people were kind of interested in and kind of discussing that, predating a lot of the Netflix kind of emphasis on these cases. I know there's a lot of work on serial killers as celebrities. We can kind of direct you to Stella's podcast because you discussed that in really great detail. But my first kind of experiences of that, and again, I'm talking about formative experiences, very early kind of experiences, used to be someone that used to read Kerrang magazine very avidly. And there was a feature on the band Cradle of Filth, particularly Danny Filth, their singer. And he was talking about what he was collecting, and it was about his kind of art collection that he was amassing, or kind of paraphernalia that he was amassing. And within that, he included kind of the artwork and portraiture of John Wayne Gacy. Also, he had shards, kind of wooden splinters from the floorboards that they dug up from the Gacy house, where he kind of hides a lot of the bodies under the crawl space and things like that. And that kind of got me to thinking about, you know, is there a certain kind of ethics or morality kind of, you know, I don't know if for me, I've kind of wanted to maybe have some of that stuff, but then maybe kind of, well, the price alone would kind of maybe suggest not. But do I really want that in my house, given the fact that that person's kind of done the heinous activities that they have? And I think, you know, we're talking about, like, Bethan kind of mentioned dark tourism as well. So, you know, people going on kind of almost pilgrimages to sites of brutal murders, or kind of, you know, to take selfies, or kind of like just document the fact that they were there. I think there's something really interesting about that. My own kind of experience that recently I bought, because I've done a bit of work on the West Memphis 3 case, some of my very early research, and I managed to come across a signed poster for the first film, the first documentary in that trilogy, The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills, and it's signed by the directors that made the film, so Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sanofsky. So it's quite interesting to have, but, you know, I've got the poster, it's been delivered. The one sheet has the mug shots of the West Memphis 3, so these guys that were wrongfully incarcerated for child murder. Obviously death row and kind of life sentences and things like that. But on the poster, you also have the images of the 3 young boys that were murdered. And I don't know, I'm kind of at odds with myself. Like, I did buy it and not really thought about what the ethical implications of having that on my wall might be. So again, it's not like I haven't bought it as a sense of, like, it's not a souvenir that I'm kind of gravitating towards in that sense. It's basically trying to document stuff that I've written about or that I'm interested in. but there's a certain ethical or moral implication there, which is it's sort of sits a bit uneasily with me. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting kind of. I mean, again, I'm kind of, am I shocked by that? Is it okay? I don't know what other people's perceptions of that might be. Maybe I'm second guessing myself a little bit. Maybe I wouldn't have cared about this so much 10 years ago. I don't know. It's kind of, yeah. So I'm kind of wrestling with that a little bit in my mind. But the Danny Filth collection, the stuff that he's got is obviously that was in Kerrang to shock people. I've got a John Wayne Gacy poster, painting rather, in my hallway. That's going to freak people out when they're going to come. Although they probably know what they're getting with Danny Filth if they're going to be a guest at some point. But there we go. So yeah.
You get us round for dinner at Filth's house.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you said maybe it's the price point that's stopping you getting some more murderabilia, I'd not really looked at it myself at all, ever, really. I knew it existed, but I'd not looked. And I had a similar situation where I was rewriting a lecture about television and fans, and the original lecture, it was somebody else's, another member of staff, and the lecture was about Doctor Who and their fans. So I was like, no, I'm not doing that. I'll rewrite it. So I've rewritten the lecture to be a true crime lecture, and I was like, okay, we're true crime fans. And then I started looking at murderabilia, and that was the first time I'd looked at it, because I don't know, it was not something I was interested in, or not something that I thought I was interested in, until I went on the site. And I shared the site with Shellie, and we both got very excited. And I found that the prices weren't as expensive as I thought. And I was like, all right, this is dangerous now. I could actually have these things for relatively not as insane amount of money as I thought. So before we move on, because I want to unpack a little bit more about fan practices and the overlap between true crime and horror fans, I just wanted to mention, because it popped into my head, and I probably should mention it because I wrote about it, with the school shooting being a sort of a thing that directors, showrunners, writers tend to not want to touch. I think it's somebody made a good point. I think they're in the Atlantic or Variety made a good point about it coming down to timing. So there was an episode of American Horror Story where, in the cult series, where she does a mass shooting takes place, and they edited it because the day before, or maybe 2 days before, there'd been a mass shooting in the States. So they edited it for when the show went out live on the Tuesday night or whatever. And they still got complaints about it because 2 days before there'd been a mass shooting. And it's kind of like, well, that's kind of, the look of the draw, really, particularly in America. But there was a scene in Ash versus Evil Dead, I can't remember which series, but he's the bad version of Ash, called Rash. And he's in a school, and it's a school like a prom disco dance type situation. And the bad version of Ash essentially just slaughters this room full of high school students with the chainsaw. And it's a brutal scene, and it goes on for ages, and it's kind of slapstick funny, but it does very much echo as it's a massacre in a school. And it didn't really get any complaints. And it was pointed out in Variety, I'm sure it was Variety, saying, it's just a matter of good luck that there'd not been a big shooting in a school that week, so they didn't have to edit it out. And it's like, ooh, that was a thing that made me feel really weird, because it was like, well, I engage with all this content, I love all this stuff, but it can be offensive if it lands at the wrong time, or maybe the right time, depending on what it does for your ratings. Anyway, I thought I'd mention it because it popped into my head. So I want to go back to fan stuff. So fan practices, we're all fans here of horror and of true crime, so there's obviously an overlap. So before I sort of hand this over to Bethan, really, because Bethan's the fans legend in here, I want to ask Shellie first about what you see in terms of the overlap between fan practice of horror and true crime, either in your research or in your own experience.
I mean, I do feel like a little bit of a pretender tonight, because I've not published that much or researched that much on true crime. It's more like a personal interest thing. But the one thing that I did publish was about fandoms, like the true crime fandom, the true crime community on Tumblr. And I think there's a lot of crossovers, because at the time, this may have existed at the time that I wrote it, because I wrote it quite a while ago, but I wasn't aware of it. There's a lot of crossovers between particularly the fandom around the Columbine killers and slashers. So a lot of the kind of same like memeable kind of content a lot of the same, they call them like imagines, when it's like a short kind of imaginary scenario with you and this character, or in the case of Klebold and Harris, real people. There's a lot of, I found, because I wasn't really aware of the they call them slasher fucker community on Tumblr when I was writing about Columbine. It would have actually really helped me write it, because there's a lot more crossovers than you would think. So there'll be something like an imaginary scenario like you've become pregnant, how the slashers react, and quite often you'll see, you know, this is how Michael Myers would react, this is how Ghostface would react, this is how Dylan Klebold would react, and suddenly you're like, oh wait, that person's real, hang on a second. So yeah, I think you can find quite a lot of crossover fan practices between those two communities in particular. More broadly than that, I guess I buy quite a lot of t-shirts from weird little websites, and you'll often see, you know, Ted Bundy t-shirt right next to a Michael Myers t-shirt, like they're put in the same kind of category. And maybe that is because of, like what I said earlier, that crossover between, well, if you're into horror, you're probably going to be into true crime, and vice versa.
Yeah, I've got Ted Bundy and serial killers on my t-shirt right now, but I'm not.
I don't want to talk about the Ted Bundy t-shirt because it's making me really sad. I've lost mine.
Oh, we'll buy you a new one, don't worry. Right,
Thank you.
Bethan, that's what you're here for. So fan true crime and overlap with horror. Go.
Okay, so Shelley's paper is really, really good, just to say. So if you're interested, you should definitely read that. But yeah, so we've talked about murderabilia already, and collecting is a massive fan practice. Like, you know, we've mentioned kind of having Negan's barbed wire covered bat, because that is an iconic item from The Walking Dead, and it's produced and it's sold to fans. You know, we've got Funko Pops of slashers, like Loungefly producing things like Chucky bags. So there's all this collecting that goes on within kind of horror fandom, and we see that in terms of serial killers as well. We get that murderabilia, as in, you know, paintings produced by serial killers, dirt from locations where victims' bodies were discovered, that sort of thing, as well as like the t-shirts, the Eric artwork, the action figures, which exist and are quite easy to get hold of. But thinking about those kind of participatory fan practices, that's something that I'm really interested in. So you will get a lot of fan fiction written about serial killers, school shooters, mass murderers, and you get a lot of fanfic written about kind of horror texts as well. So there's a ton of fan fiction about The Walking Dead, things like, you know, slashing the characters. So slash in terms of fan fiction is putting two canonically straight characters into a gay relationship. So it comes from Kirk / Spock in Star Trek. That's like the genesis of slash as a fanfic genre. So you get that with The Walking Dead, you get it with, you know, Nightmare on Elm Street, you get it with Columbine and, you know, Richard Ramirez / Jeffrey Dahmer. And so I've written a chapter on school shooter fanfic that specifically looks at these kind of texts. And it's exactly the same. It's a fan practice that fan art as well. So there's a ton of fan art about, a lot of it about Columbine, because that's one of the that's like the mainstay sort of this kind of fandom, for want of a better word. But then you've also got, you know, fan art of Freddy Krueger. So all of this stuff, it's the same thing. It's the same behaviors and the same practices. Just one is with a fictional text, you know, the horror film, the horror book, whatever, and one is with kind of real people. So, and when you get down to it, there's no difference. It's the same thing. It's just received very, very differently by the mass media, by the general public. So you'll see a lot of, you know, oh my God, these obsessed teenage fangirls lusting after these bad boys. Whereas, you know, if we write fic about, like I said, Freddy Krueger, that goes completely by the by. It's completely ignored. So there's a difference in the reaction and the response to it, rather than the fan practices and behaviours.
Yeah, it's really weird. So you were talking then, like I'm nodding along and listening, and then you know, you're talking about the slash fiction between the Columbine boys, and it was and you know, coming from me into all of this stuff as well, it was that sentence that made me go, oh, and it's like, why is it that one that makes me recoil slightly? When, you know, it's very odd.
Yeah, it's
Really
been really interesting. So right in this chapter, I've read about I specifically looked at school shooters and mass killers, so I excluded serial killer fanfic. So I looked at, it was around like 180 stories, I think. And the ones that didn't bother me at all were the ones where readers were kind of inserting themselves into the story and like falling in love with, you know, Dylan or Eric or whoever, or in some cases joining them in shooting up the school. Those ones I was fine with. The ones that I was a bit like, oh, I'm not comfortable with this, was the pure slash stories. So it's just really graphic descriptions of sex between Dylan and Eric, and that is how, you know, that's how fanfic writers refer to them, is very much first person. And I was like, why do I feel weird about that? Because I'm not bothered, you know, if you slash Negan and Daryl, I haven't got a problem with that at all. So yeah, it's interesting, like those visceral reactions as researchers, I think is
anything to add to the fan practices, Tom, you know, apart from Danny Filth's hallway?
Working, yes. Yeah, I'm on. Okay. I think for me, sort of like, I'm really interested in kind of subcultures within horror and kind of music and how they kind of cross over. So that's kind of where a lot of my research kind of is at the moment. Talking about films and bands who kind of work together, or kind of, you know, horror films about bands or whatever. So a lot of kind of my, I suppose, early interest in kind of true crime. Again, you know, I've written a lot and researched a lot about, you know, I've already mentioned the West Memphis Three, but kind of coming to that through bands that were kind of doing benefit albums or kind of concerts to get those three young guys exonerated. Kind of led me into reading around the case history and kind of what it meant. And a lot of like the discourse around that was how these young guys were kind of like me, sort of like they were a bit gothy. They liked sort of heavy metal music. They like Stephen King, and they like watching horror films. And like there was a lot of kind of self-identification with that, in the way that the films were kind of obviously made, was to say that, you know, based on these interests or kind of outsider interests, they're kind of being railroaded and they're devil worshippers and they must have committed these heinous acts. So I think, you know, doing the research around that particular case, and obviously looking at the musicians and bands and kind of how they were promoting music as a means of kind of raising funds for subsequent trials and appeal hearings as well. That was quite interesting. And you know, I've bought albums years after the fact, obviously, that initially would have been there to fund or kind of help or assist in the kind of the appeal hearings that those guys had after they'd been jailed. The other thing with that is looking at sort of work that's been done around zines and kind of sort of more independent press sort of materials, especially around the horror genre, or maybe even cult and exploitation cinemas. And a lot of that material also includes kind of imagery or stories about true crime, about serial killers, about films that have been made about them. And obviously, you know, it goes into a little bit of research, quite, you know, sensationalist rhetoric around that to kind of get the gore hounds, as it were, kind of engage with that. But there's some quite interesting academic work that's been done over the past few years that kind of examines that kind of crossover. And I do think, you know, we're kind of talking here about Venn diagrams of fan interests and where we would probably position ourselves within that. There's sort of lots of spheres of influence going on there. So yeah, I guess not necessarily any formative or formal research around fandom, but definitely kind of interested in the subcultural elements of that. That's kind of where I would be coming into that discussion, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Venn diagram is absolutely right, isn't it? Like, there's so much crossover here. Yeah, we haven't got time to go into it all. All right, I'm conscious of the time, and I just want to sort of deal with this last question. here before we then throw it out and see if anybody's got any questions for us. So that given we've kind of, we've established that there's lots of overlap and there's lots of layers, given that horror borrows from true crime and true crime borrows from horror in certain texts, what do you think that does to either genre? And I think this kind of brings us back full circle to where we started thinking about Silence of the Lambs. So thinking about what we might consider, or what other people might consider, the trashier elements, so sensationalizing true crime or sensationalizing horror for the sake of it, or the exploitative nature of both genres, that are use of gore or not using gore, things like that. Like, what do you think when they borrow from each other, what does it do to them, do you think? So, when I was thinking about this question myself, I was thinking about the backlash that generally happened. So there was backlash, obviously, against the Dahmer Monster series. Everyone saying it was sensational, it was exploitative, and that family members of victims, some of them had been asked about it, some of them had not, and then the ones that had been asked got angry, and all that stuff was going on. So there was a discussion going on that I saw that was talking about good true crime and bad true crime. So good true crime, it's just telling the story quite soberly, and then bad true crime is the stuff that brings in the horror and makes it really visceral and makes it really visual, and makes it feel like a horror film, makes it feel perhaps too fictionalized, rather than telling the truth of the story. So that's what I was thinking. It made me think about the backlash against certain true crime texts. But let's swing this back around to Shellie.
My microphone's being really weird. I think it's really interesting what you said about when it's too in your face, when it's too visceral, it feels more fictionalized. Because I find it kind of more, not offensive. Offensive is the wrong word, but murder is horrible and gory and gross and bloody and smelly and greasy and everything else. And I almost feel more not offended, but like the more kind of sanitized versions of true crime stories, they're the ones that kind of make me, you were talking earlier about things that make you recoil, they're the ones that make me go, why have they made it so clean and tidy?
It's so palatable. Like, this subject,
yeah,
horrible.
Yeah, like, let's not make it palatable, let's make it horrible, because it is horrible.
Bethan, what do you think to that final question?
I sort of had two things I was thinking of. So the first one is making true crime entertaining, by drawing on, by making it more fictionalized, by drawing on these kind of, stylistic choices that we see in horror. And there's, been huge arguments about true crime as entertainment, and that leads into, the ethics and sensationalization of it. But yeah, do the two genres kind of converging mean that true crime becomes more like entertainment than, not entertainment, than just this factual stuff? But then the other thing I was thinking of, and I'm guilty of it when I write about true crime, is true crime is more than just murder. So, there's frauds, there's all of this other stuff that is true crime. But that doesn't get picked up on very much. Like, there was that Netflix series about, or was it Anna, that Russian fraud woman? But there's very, very few that kind of cover stuff that isn't sensationalized murder. And I kind of think, I don't know, how does that come into it? And because if horror focuses a lot on, the visceral and the gory and the scary, what happens to the other true crime stuff that isn't any of those things?
Yeah, well, I guess it's going to come down to the businesses of the media companies making it, isn't it? Because they're going to make what sells. And Netflix, we keep mentioning Netflix things, but Netflix, no, they get the views, they get the subscribers, and they I found this really awful phrase that is apparently being bandied around the Netflix offices these days. They're calling it the Bundy bump. So it's where, it's where they've made a scripted version of something, and then they have a documentary or non-scripted version. So they had, or maybe it goes the other way around. Either way, they're calling it the Bundy bump. So when they had the Conversations with the Killer, the Ted Bundy tapes, and then Berlinger also made Extremely Wicked, both of those did spectacularly well. And then we had the Dahmer tapes and the Dahmer series. And so, yeah, that they're calling it the Bundy bump. And it's like, really? Can we not do that? But it works as a business model because people might get a subscription to watch the series and then stay for the doc. And then while they're there, they might as well watch some more stuff over the month, and then they stay. And, you know, fraud, whilst fascinating, maybe it's not the one for the cash. I could only assume that's the reason, just always money, innit? All right, Tommy, then I'll bring this last question to you then before I see if there's any questions on the go.
I think for me, someone that kind of comes to true crime, talked kind of about my sort of formative examples of horror and kind of coming into contact with a range of different cases via sort of horror cinema. Suppose like the other side of that is documentary, and obviously I'm not going to use this space to kind of debate and discuss documentary theory because I know that I'll get a lot of audible groans and inaudible groans from the audience. But I guess for me, when we're kind of situating these things on Netflix or kind of using those models of formats almost kind of play into this a little bit more now. And I was going to revisit some of the stuff that I did on documentary in the wake of something like it was kind of the Stephen Avery case, Making a Murderer on Netflix, and obviously the kind of 10 episodic structure about like, we as filmmakers know about all of this information. We're going to kind of spoon feed it to you. So at the end of every episode, there's a cliffhanger, and then that's going to be you binging it so you can discuss it with whoever else the next day. And that was kind of almost like an event or an event TV in its own right. So I don't know if that's kind of informing a lot of the way that the kind of more fictionalized, dramatized versions of things are happening as well, because it's kind of, it still feels like exploitation cinema tactics in a roundabout way. The other thing that I wanted to kind of just touch upon there is I was kind of at the moment I'm teaching this sort of general module at university where students can kind of come up with any kind of idea. It's kind of like a dissertation style essay what they're writing. And one of my students was a massive One Direction fan. And obviously Liam from One Direction's obviously sadly passed away over the past few weeks. So she wanted to write an essay about fandom and interpersonal relationships with celebrity figures and this kind of outpouring of grief and the fact that, you know, she'd never actually met this particular person. And that got me to thinking about various cases that have been documented within horror, within true crime, of these kind of extreme sort of fan connections. And maybe we're going back to some of the elements that we've already talked about. But I was kind of interested in this case, this guy called Ricardo Lopez. So in the mid 1990s, this guy had an obsession with the singer Bjork, to the extent that as a result of his affections, he was going to send her a kind of a parcel bomb that was going to explode. And obviously the idea was that she was going to die as a result of that. And he was obviously this kind of individual that had a lot of sort of problems, mental health problems and things like that. I think it was like schizophrenic and all this kind of stuff. He documented his final moments, this kind of, it's like a 70-minute kind of video diary in 1996, the end of which he sadly ends his own life. And that particular sequence has been remediated quite a lot in examples of cinema. I think there was an Albanian horror film that kind of dramatized that and fictionalized that. It's been kind of used in more kind of transgressive music videos and things like that. So I don't know. I think I'm not necessarily answering the question here, but I do think that overlap between the more. I mean that video diary is quite mundane. It's like 80 minutes before something happens, and it's just kind of, you know, it gets more disturbing as it goes on. So, you know, the form of that, it's like a static frame of someone kind of, you know, they are going to end their life. And obviously I've came to that via some kind of, I think it was an Instagram page about dark material. And a lot of that's kind of linked to serial killer interviews. There's obviously a lot of Ted Bundy material on there as well. But obviously that's informed sort of maybe more niche examples of horror as well. So I think, that's kind of the real violence and kind of real viscerality, is something which was quite abrasive to me. I'm not necessarily sure I should have recommended my student maybe go and investigate that a little bit. But that was kind of where that discussion went. It'll be an interesting essay to get, I guess, after Christmas to mark. But there we go. Sorry, I said I wasn't going to go off on these mad tangents. Yeah, that's all I have to say about that, I think. Anyway.
Well, maybe that's what the true crime genre might end up doing, because is there a possibility that, like Bethan mentioned formats, is there a possibility that it's gonna maybe burn itself out in the way that it's running now? That are we gonna be done with the Netflix style documentary? Are we gonna be done with HBO making a shiny glossy drama about Michael Peterson? Do we need that story again? Maybe it needs more experimental things, perhaps, in the same way that horror experiments as well. All right then, so I pretty much come to the end of my questions. Thanks for all your answers. I've got a question here from Laura that she's happy for me to read out. So Bethan described true crime as being seen as a woman's genre, which struck me as interesting given how horror was seen as masculine. Leaving aside the obvious problematic issues with those binary categorizations, does the panel have any thoughts about that opposition, given the otherwise obvious connections and overlaps between horror and true crime? I think it really bugs me much in the same way that it bugged me when I told people that I was studying and researching horror, that people would be like, why about it? And I think true crime is put in the box of women's things alongside, say, like soaps and reality TV. So it's seen as, not by everyone, but can be seen as, what you're studying that for? So I always feel like I have to explain myself a little bit, or try and talk my way around not sounding like the serial killer fan, and it becomes something that I feel like I have to defend, which is like, well, actually, no, that's bollocks. Like, I like it, so I'm going to research it. Like, why else? I'm in this position, so that's what I'm going to do. So yeah, I do find it really bothersome, this idea of it being, just for women, when perhaps, lots of the true crime documentary filmmakers are all men. Berlinger, for example, So yeah, I'll throw that to the panel. What do you think about this very odd gendering of true crime?
I mean, oh, sorry, Tom, go ahead.
On mute. I don't know if I'm on mute. I don't know what's happening anymore. Bethan, if you want to come in and answer, I'm just going to be pontificating. Go for it. Like, that's totally fine. Don't worry.
And I was thinking about it because, like, my background is predominantly fan studies. And this gendering is not a new thing in fan studies. So we've sort of got this idea of affirmative, affirmational fandom, which is, you watch the show and then you collect all the action figures and you learn all of the, statistics about how the Daleks were created on Doctor Who, and that is seen as a very male form of fandom. And then you've got transformative fandom, which is your fan art, your fan fiction, your cosplay, and that's seen as a very female form of fandom. And it's really frustrating because actually that's not the case. But it's doing this murderabilia questionnaire, this research. So you get, as Laura said in her question, this idea that true crime is a women's genre. 19 of my respondents are men, and who collect murderabilia. 10 are women, but the majority are men. So you've kind of got this affirmational fandom in kind of fan studies terms because they're collecting the stuff, but it's related to true crime rather than horror because it's, your serial killers and stuff like that. So that binary doesn't work. And it's a very, very simplistic way of looking at these kind of audiences and behaviors and practices and stuff, which actually doesn't translate when you start doing the research. And it gets very frustrating. And part of it, I think, maybe is just lazy journalism in some respects. Part of it is sensational journalism because, if you say all of these, obsessed teenagers are right into I don't know, whoever the latest, killer is, you're going to get clicks on it. So yeah, it's frustrating as a researcher coming from that fan studies background.
Well, that's interesting because 2 years ago ish, roughly. I went to see the last podcast on the left live in Manchester, and I reckon most of that audience was women as well. And that's three men doing a true crime aliens cryptids podcast, mainly making jizz jokes, and the audience was mainly women. So, you know, does it, yeah, it's, you know, possibly like a tabloid lazy way of categorizing these fans. Tom, did you have something to say about that?
I was just thinking, like, there's been the past few years when I've been teaching various modules, it comes to mind that whenever we've kind of done anything on true crime or kind of related subject matter, the students that have chosen to do either projects or assessments based on that particular topic has been my students who are young women, I guess. So that might range from students that have written dissertations on representations of the Yorkshire Ripper. So there was a docu-series on BBC, I think, was a few years ago. They were kind of talking about that, and obviously victimhood and sex work and sex positivity and all of this kind of stuff. I had a film script last year from one of my students who was from Northern Ireland, who wanted to do this kind of it was kind of a slasher film, kind of Sweeney Todd-esque narrative, whereby you had this lady who owned a bakery who was murdering people and then kind of, you know, baking them into pies and all, well, like Sweeney Todd, I guess. But like she was kind of doing it from the political context of Northern Ireland and the Trouble. So the idea was that these murders were happening, but they couldn't find who the murderers were because it was just afforded to kind of sectarian violence and things like that. But then the research for that led the student to finding out about the Shankill Butchers, who were a group of people that were doing this in the sort of late 70s and 80s and things like that. So I suppose I know that's anecdotal. I'm not claiming that to be any kind of rigorous research at all. But some of my experiences of that, like, you know, I think it has been mostly young women who have been writing about that, or gravitating towards kind of discussions of that. In terms of representation, in terms of identity politics, in terms of some really interesting kind of ways of unpicking how those narratives are kind of presented to us across different media forms, which I think's really interesting. So yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks. All right. And I'll move on to the next question. So how do we, I guess, negotiate the dicey ethics, I'm very much enjoying the phrase dicey ethics, of considering the victims of these true crime cases in your work and the enjoyment you draw from watching these shows and films? I don't know. I think, do you know what? Honestly, the first time that I was kind of, that I really thought about it properly was when I was, you know, in doing the podcast and having to outline some cases before I talked about the media that then told the cases. Right. I was careful how I described the actual crime itself, and I tried not to dwell too much on details, just because like that's not what I'm doing this podcast for. So I tried to avoid it because I didn't feel that was my job in that moment. I think where I have been really careful in terms of thinking about the ethics of this is when I was doing some research where I was looking at Instagram users and their sort of their experience, their posts talking about their favorite serial killer and whatnot. And I was really careful not to name any of those Instagram users, despite the fact that the comments that they were making were public, because I didn't feel it was my place to name them for saying whatever it was that they were saying about Dahmer. And even in that, like, it was, I was making the point that the Instagram users were not talking about the victims at all. They were just talking about how much they loved Dahmer and sort of questioning how problematic that was, if it is indeed problematic at all. Do we have to expect the fans to be mindful of all these things? So it made me think about it, but I managed to circumnavigate it by just talking about Instagram, because I think the honest truth of it is, if I perhaps think about it too hard, I might realize that maybe I'm unhappy with it all and I feel really bad, and I don't want to do that. I want to do my research. So maybe that's a really bad thing to say on a recorded Zoom. So Shellie, what do you think about that? How do you negotiate the dicey ethics? Maybe you do it better than I do.
Probably not. I think, like with the bit of research that I've done on true crime, the Columbine killers, I was really more looking at the fans of they call themselves the Columbiners, the fans of the Columbine killers, rather than the actual event or the victims themselves. And I had like a little bit of a kind of a discussion in there. First series of American Horror Story, and Tate does this school shooting that is very much inspired, I think, by Columbine. And there was a article that was talking about, I can't remember exactly, something about him asking a character something, the way they responded, and this wasn't the way someone responded in real life. And I didn't go into too much depth with it because I kind of felt like it wasn't my place. It's like, oh, I'm writing about this fictional representation that is very much, I think, kind of not a product of the trauma of Columbine, but is trying to kind of connect with that in some way. So that's kind of how I got around the ethics of it. But I think, like what you said is true. You know, just as you're saying, should you expect fans to also take all these things into account in researching something? You know, eventually, if you try to cover everything, you run out of space, right? So, you know, you're talking about, you know, I know the work that you're doing, you're talking about all these different kind of media forms and how true crime narratives are spread across these. Is there also room in that to have an entire chapter about the ethics of that? Or is that, you know, you're laying the groundwork and that's for someone else to take that and do that? So yeah, I don't know if that actually answered the question or if I just babbled for a bit, but
yeah, it does. It's yeah, I think it's just, we know that if we're engaging with true crime, if there is an element of grubbiness about it, if you're engaging with it, then you are in that. And I don't know. Bethan, help me.
Don't know if I can help you. So I guess thinking about my research, so like my primary consideration is for my research participants. Like that's my first ethical consideration. Rightly or wrongly, my concern isn't for the victims of these crimes, it's for the people that I'm conducting the research with. So with the school shooter fan fiction chapter that I wrote, it was very much considering, okay, do I name these writers, like the works, and I only looked at works that were public, because the platform I was using, you can choose to hide works from people unless they're logged in. So it was kind of, okay, am I going to like quote extracts from this work, or am I going to paraphrase it? Kind of that kind of thing. And I was particularly interested because the stories that were being written and the discussions that were being had in the comments were very self-aware. So these writers were talking about, well, you know, this is more than just me like shipping Eric and Dylan. You know, I was at a point in my school life, I nearly committed a school shooting myself. So how do we think about, you know, emotional trauma and toxic masculinity? And I'm working through this in my story. And I'm kind of interested in moving beyond these very reductive ideas of true crime fans in the work that I'm doing. In terms of like my own, oh, and actually thinking about, so I've done some work on the Gabby Petito and the Nicola Bulley cases, and in those, because there was a lot of like active, you know, with the Nicola Bulley case, there were people going to her town and like digging up what they thought was a crime scene, which is blatantly ridiculous. But in those pieces, I talk particularly about Nicola and Gabby as the victims and considering the ethics of kind of true crime fandom, and I've written a chapter about that. With my own watching of true crime, like part of me, and again I'm a bit like, should I really be saying this on a recorded podcast? But because I'm researching this stuff and I know the ethics of it, I'm like, and I don't want to say am I better than other like non-academic users, but I can think critically about it. So maybe that is a way of sort of addressing the ethical issues. And I end up invariably writing about whatever bloody thing I'm watching. So it kind of all becomes research then anyway. So it's like, well, is it enjoyment, or is it just I'm watching this and then I'm going to write about it because that's apparently what I do? I don't think that was particularly helpful for you, Stella.
Well, that's the response I give to my husband. Are we watching another one? Yeah, I'm working. And we'll just see how it goes. And then he goes and does something else, so it's fine. Anything? Do you want to add anything to that, Tom, or shall I move on to the next question?
I think for me, in terms of ethics, obviously my work, I guess, around true crime was published as the case was kind of still an ongoing thing. Again, talking about the West Memphis Three, they weren't kind of released from prison until kind of, you know, soon after I just kind of started writing about them, really. And for me, it was kind of very much aware that any form of documentation or representation, when we're trying to sort of talk about a narrative that it is being controlled in one respect by some documentary filmmakers or kind of other adaptations of that, anything that you're kind of producing to talk about or critique is kind of just adding to the sea of discourse around that. And I do think for me, you know, I'm not saying that, you know, my article on something's going to be widely read or kind of seen more than whatever film version is going to be made about a case. But like, you know, I was quite transparent with that and say, you know, I'm aware that the work that I'm doing is also detrimental to kind of what I'm trying not to do, because I'm sort of like, I'm still muddying the waters. I'm kind of presenting my take on what's happening. And that's kind of a little bit problematic to an extent. So that was kind of that was always on my mind in terms of ethical considerations, but also kind of thinking about, you know, the victims, you know, for all intents and purposes, for this particular case that I wrote about, you know, no one knows who murdered those young boys yet. And that still kind of doesn't sit right with me either, and where that kind of case lies now. It's obviously a cold case that, you know, kind of there was the anniversary of the release from prison was earlier, this might have been last month actually, or fairly recently. So it kind of keeps cropping up from time to time, thinking, yeah, we still don't know who murdered those boys. I think on Facebook someone had said, oh, it would have been the 40th birthday of Stephen Branch, who was one of the kids that was killed. And for someone that's maybe a couple of years older than me, it's a bit interesting. I don't think that necessarily, to go back to the question, I don't necessarily think the true crime and kind of stuff that I've been writing about is something that I particularly enjoy or I'm entertained by. Like maybe I am, but not. It's more of a kind of an interest. Maybe that is entertainment. I don't know if that kind of, I don't necessarily know if I've ever considered that in the same way. Maybe if I did, I'd be more problematized by the stuff I've done, I guess. So yeah, I'll shut up if you want to get on the next question. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's a question I was kind of grappling with maybe about 18 months ago. Sort of, where's the line between, or when does it become entertainment, or is it always all entertainment? And I was thinking about, you know, podcasts that are funny, like say Last Podcast or Roll Killer or things like that. And it's like, well, I'm howling laughing at this, but the story isn't funny. So where's the line? Is there a line? I don't know. All right then. So a question from Catherine. I was wondering if anyone can speak a bit to the role of detectives in these true crime / murder shows. In horror, there is more focus on the killer and victims, but those that focus on true crime tend to have a detective storyline in line with documentaries. Yeah. What does this bring to these shows? Does it dilute the victims or allow them to have a voice that they might not normally? Even something like Silence of the Lambs is more detective than horror. That's interesting, isn't it? I would say that for true crime stuff that's detective led, I tend to not engage with that too much, and maybe that's just because it's not as sensational, perhaps. But the last one that I did really enjoy was ITV's Des, that was all about the investigation, the sort of the weird backwards investigation that they had to do because they had the murderer, but they didn't have the victims. And that was all about the investigation and the detectives. And I did enjoy that. But I think if you've got like your more like standard crime show that is detective / police led, I'm probably not going to watch it. I don't think, maybe because there's just not enough murders in it. Shellie, you were nodding along with me. Back me up.
Yeah, I'm probably the same. I mean, I watched one, I burned through the new JonBenet Ramsey one on Netflix last night, and that was quite kind of detective led. I think for me as well, like it's very easy for stuff to go into Vera territory for me, and like my dislike of the TV show Vera is well documented. So if it's too police led, then yeah, I'm the same as you. I'm probably just gonna lose interest unless it's something like the JonBenet Ramsey one last night. Is fair. I don't want to ruin it for you because I know it just come out. I don't know if you've watched it yet. But that was an interesting one because it was revisiting things and looking at it from a different angle. Whereas if it's just a recounting of, and then we did this, and then we arrested him, and then I'm like, yeah, cool, okay, I don't care. Which is, yeah, maybe I need a bit more gore and murder. Maybe I'm a terrible person.
We're all horrible people. Sorry. Bethan?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of wondering, because I am wondering whether there's more of a movement in true crime content to kind of look at the killers, or, you know, glamorize the killers. I mean, I'm thinking about some of the Netflix stuff. But then, because obviously my interest is in sort of fan practice, so thinking about things like Making a Murderer, where there's quite a lot about the process, even if not necessarily the detectives, although they are interviewed. So whether there's something there about showing the poor work by police, because, you know, that was brought up quite a lot in Making a Murderer. There was a huge amount of backlash against the police in like the Gabby Petito and the Nicola Bulley cases, and then that leads into what I've called forensic fandom, in terms of just regular viewers, you know, social media users investigating themselves and trying to work out what's happened. So I'm wondering whether there's kind of this pushback against police involvement, or how useful or how effective the police are in thinking about some of these cases, which I don't think really answers the question at all. But that's where my mind was going.
It's like the I mean, it seems like anything now to do with the Yorkshire Ripper, just so it's like, that was a shit show. How could you even, the word investigation is a strong word for what they didn't do. But yeah, maybe that's just coming back around again to stories that we already know. So, you know, do we need to see the police cock it up again? Probably not. Tom, anything to add?
I mean, I really like this idea of the documentarian as detective. I think that's really interesting, especially, you know, thinking about, I mean, Nick Broomfield's work always comes to mind there, the stuff with Eileen Wournos in particular, and obviously the political dimension of that, sort of what he was trying to uncover, and trying to advocate in terms of obviously someone sentenced to death who was clearly had mental health problems, and what the issues were with that. I think I'm kind of thinking maybe more, I guess, fiction, which is obviously related to true crime, which is obviously detective led, and perhaps one of the most I don't know, heinous things to happen in recent years has been the cancellation of something like Mindhunter on Netflix. The David Fincher obviously helmed drama series about the FBI and kind of their investigations and interview techniques with people like Ed Kemper, and I think it was kind of going towards Charles Manson and kind of the Atlanta Monster style kind of podcast was also kind of adjacent to that as well. I think they're really interesting. I always kind of find it quite, you know, the detective as a cipher for us to kind of have access into these narratives and these histories and things like that. I'm just going to end my comment here by giving a shout out to Vera, because one of my former students is the production secretary on Vera. Not that that says anything about the quality of the show, but, you know, I'm going to take that one. Exit the industry, which is always very impressive, but there we go. Yeah.
All right then. Question for Shellie in particular. So from Laura, I wondered if Shellie had any thoughts about true crime as a genre for dealing with trauma. That's your box of frogs, isn't it? That's badly phrased. But I'm thinking about her work on trauma and fan footage, and the example of The Sacrament. Yes, in particular, does true crime offer potential for engaging with / addressing historical trauma? Oh,
I think so. I mean, I think The Sacrament is a really good example of it. The Sacrament, if people haven't seen it, is a Ty West film. I think the best Ty West film that he ever did. And it's based very much on Jonestown. So when it came out, it didn't do particularly well. I think it's produced by Eli Roth, which, depending on who you talk to, either helped it or didn't help it. But it was criticised for kind of using the Jonestown story, but not directly saying that it was using the Jonestown story. And I remember, because I wrote about it in my book on found footage horror, there was someone, a reviewer, who said that using real life horror as a basis for fictional horror was offensive. And it's like, I hate to tell you guys, but like, we've been doing that since forever, so you can't really pick on this one film for doing it. So yeah, I think, you know, I argue in the book that The Sacrament provides a space to work through the trauma of Jonestown, and I think that true crime can do that too. So I was thinking, probably because I watched the John Bonet thing last night, the casting John Bonet one, that was Kitty Green, I think, directed it, and I think that was also on Netflix. But it was she's a documentarian. She went, I can't remember the ins and outs of it, but she went to the community where it happened, Boulder, Colorado, and did like a casting call. We're going to recreate the John Bonet Ramsey case, and casting Patsy Ramsey, the mum, and John Ramsey, the dad, and Burke, the son, the brother, and John Bonet herself. So there's always people from the actual community where it happened. Obviously, the children don't really remember, because I think it was 1990, I want to say 6, but I'm not 100%-ish. So they weren't even alive, but a lot of the parents were, or people had kind of migrated to that area, or, you know, migrated from that area and come back. And really what the documentary ends up being is these people talking about being in the community when it happened, the impact on the community, how they felt, you know, did they know the Ramseys, did they not, how the media represented their community. So on a very kind of, not micro level, but on a community level, that I think it's called Casting John Bonet, that kind of stands as a really clear example of kind of a community working through this quite recent trauma, and people that were really there. And it's a really interesting documentary, the way it's put together, all the different kind of theories and stuff. Having watched the one last night, I now feel a little bit differently about that documentary, but I'm gonna stay stum because people might not have watched it yet.
I've not seen it yet. That's for the weekend. Right, last question, I reckon, because it's 8:25, from Stephanie. In trying to make sense of the state of, well, everything, I've been wondering lately if there's a connection between how popular true crime and serial killer narratives are, especially those that centre the killer instead of the victim, and the rise of criminal and morally reprehensible public figures. If our entertainment is about killers, do we think, well, felony fraud isn't so bad? Do we think there's a connection there? I don't know. I think perhaps with, even though it's never a simple story, I think there's maybe something to be said with the rehashing of, say, the Dahmer story and the Bundy story over and over again. They're relatively simple stories. There's a bad guy, and that's clear who the bad guy is. And there's some good guys, the cops, you know, questionable, and good guys catch bad guy is dead. So I think there's something in the simplicity of knowing who the bad person is and what they've done and why it's bad. Whereas maybe perhaps some more complex fraud cases, maybe it's just too muddy and we're not sure who's the bad guy. I don't know. You know, like Bethan said before, like with all of the true crime around that is about serial killers, I'm also guilty of only watching those ones and maybe not engaging with the stuff about frauds or catfishing or whatever. But I wonder if it is something about the simplicity of the serial killer narrative. Anyone else? Last comments?
For some reason, I've just started thinking about the early cinema of Rob Zombie and his kind of veneration of Charles Manson as some kind of cultural anti-hero in terms of the rhetoric that he espoused. I don't know why that's making me think of that. Maybe it's something that is another research project that I'll never get around to doing. I don't know. I think I would agree with sort of Stella's comments about, you know, there's these kind of definite formulas almost now in terms of, you know, the bad acts are committed. You know, it might be the ineffective investigation. Something comes to light. These people are then kind of captured, convicted, executed, or whatever. And there's a certain degree of finality to that, which doesn't seem to kind of ring true with some of the kind of more, I guess, larger than life figures which are running the show at the moment. The kind of real life supervillains, I guess, is kind of what I always think about them. These people that are like multi-billionaires with all the world's wealth and all of this kind of information and control. It's like Lex Luthor or something like that. I don't know. But yeah, that's quite a depressing thought, I guess. I'm not sure what else to say about that, really. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know how that links with Charles Manson and anti-heroism, but there we go. I don't know. Anyway,
Bethan, have you got any final thoughts on that before we close?
I'm just sort of thinking, I don't know, maybe pushing back a bit on like the rise of criminal and morally reprehensible public figures, because I think they've always been criminal and morally reprehensible public figures. It's just perhaps we're a bit more aware of how criminal and morally reprehensible they are because of, you know, wider global media, social media, blah blah blah, all of that sort of thing. So yeah, because I think if we look at, you know, historical public figures, they've been criminal, maybe not as much as some current, soon to be future presidents, but I think that's always been there's always been an element maybe that public figures are perhaps drawn maybe to more dark tendencies, but that's probably a whole other thing about, you know, narcissism and personality traits, and we haven't got time for that.
So basically what we're saying at the end here then is that we're all doomed. Yeah. Okay, good. Right, that's it. I think that will bring it to a close. Pretty much bang on 8:30. Thank you everyone so much for mention Bundy again. There you go. I've got Bundy on my t-shirt. There you go. Thanks everyone for listening. Really appreciate you coming and hanging out with us on this chilly, busy Wednesday evening. Thanks to the lovely panel. It's lovely to see your faces, and thanks to the Horror Sig gals for organising it in the first place.
And thanks to you, Stella.
Thanks ever so much. Thank you to Stella for excellent sharing, and thanks to Tom, Bethan and Shellie for a really great chat. Thank you to everybody who came along and all your great questions. We'll be back in January, we hope, with an event on horror gaming. More information to follow, we hope. And then again in February with an event on men and masculinity in horror. So keep your eyes peeled on our socials and our websites and stuff, and so on. I've put some links in the chat. But yeah, thank you very much, everybody, and until next time.